The frozen breath escaped Officer Jake Nolan's lips like ghostly whispers in the December night as he tugged gently on Diesel's leash, ready to end another quiet shift in Franklin, Indiana. The retired Canine's paws had carried him through Afghan battlefields, through smoke-filled buildings, through moments where life and death balanced on the edge of a single bark. But tonight, under the amber glow of streetlights that cast long shadows across empty sidewalks, Jake expected nothing more than the familiar crunch of snow beneath their boots and the distant hum of late-night traffic. The garbage truck's hydraulic whine cut through the silence like a mechanical beast awakening from slumber, its yellow warning lights painting the darkness in rhythmic pulses. Diesel had been padding alongside Jake, with the casual gait of a veteran who'd earned his rest, his graying muzzle a testament to years of service that had saved countless lives in a war zone half a world away. But something shifted in that moment when the truck's engine growled to life. Jake felt it first in the sudden tension of the leash, then in the way Diesel's entire body seemed to transform from relaxed companion to focused weapon. The dog's ears snapped forward like radar dishes, locking onto a target, his muscles coiling beneath his winter coat with the precision of a trained soldier who'd never forgotten his purpose. Jake's stomach tightened with recognition of that stance, that unmistakable alertness that had preceded every life-saving discovery in the sand-swept chaos of Afghanistan. The night air suddenly felt thinner, charged with an electricity that made Jake's skin prickle beneath his uniform. Diesel planted his feet on the icy pavement and refused to move, his dark eyes fixed on the back of the garbage truck with an intensity that sent ice through Jake's veins. This wasn't casual interest or simple distraction. This was the focused attention of a Canine who had found something that demanded immediate action. Jake had seen that look pierce through desert darkness, had watched those same eyes lock onto hidden explosives that could have vaporized entire convoys, and now, on a quiet residential street where children's bicycles lay forgotten in front yards and porch lights flickered like dying stars, Diesel was telling him that danger lurked in the shadows, that something precious hung in the balance between salvation and tragedy. The garbage truck lurched forward, its mechanical arms reaching for the black bin like metallic claws preparing to feed. Jake's pulse hammered against his temples as Diesel's throat released a sound that shattered the night's silence. The bark erupted from Diesel's chest like cannon fire, raw and desperate, and absolutely terrifying in its urgency. Jake had heard that exact sound only twice before, both times when hidden bombs threatened to tear apart everything he'd sworn to protect. The garbage truck driver, a heavy-set man whose fluorescent vest glowed like a beacon in the darkness, stepped down from his cab with the annoyed expression of someone whose routine had been interrupted by noise. But Jake barely registered the man's presence, because every nerve in his body was screaming that something catastrophic was about to unfold in front of his eyes. Diesel lunged toward the truck with such force that the leash nearly slipped from Jake's grip, the dog's powerful frame trembling, not with fear, but with the desperate need to prevent something unspeakable. The hydraulic arms began lifting the black bin toward the truck's hungry maw, and Diesel's barks became more frantic, more urgent, echoing off the silent houses like an alarm that no one else could hear. Jake's training kicked in with brutal clarity as he recognized the signs of a dog who had detected something that could save or destroy a human life. His hand shot up toward the driver, while his other hand struggled to control Diesel's increasingly desperate attempts to reach the rising container. The mechanical whine of the hydraulic system filled the air like the sound of approaching death, and Jake realized with crystal clarity that they had seconds, maybe less, before whatever Diesel had detected would be lost forever. The bin swayed in the mechanical grip, and from somewhere deep within its dark interior came a sound so faint, so heartbreakingly fragile, that Jake's blood turned to ice in his veins. It wasn't the scrape of metal against metal or the rustle of garbage settling. It was organic, alive and utterly desperate, a whimper that could only come from something small and helpless and fighting for its very existence. Jake's world narrowed to a single terrifying truth as he stared at the container suspended above the truck's crushing mechanism, realizing that Diesel hadn't just detected danger. He had found a life that hung by the thinnest of threads, a soul whose next breath depended entirely on whether Jake could stop the machinery of indifference before it was too late. The driver's hand hovered over the controls, while Diesel's barks reached a crescendo of desperation that seemed to tear through the fabric of the night itself. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel Canine Loyal Souls, where we uncover true stories of animals' bravery you won't believe until you see it. In the frozen heart of December, when winter's grip tightens around small Midwestern towns like Franklin, Indiana, most people retreat behind locked doors and drawn curtains, surrendering the streets to silence and shadows. But for some souls, the darkness becomes a canvas where destiny paints its most profound masterpieces with brushstrokes of courage, instinct, and unbreakable bonds forged in the crucible of shared service. This is the story of Diesel, a German shepherd whose keen senses were sharpened on the battlefields of Afghanistan, where every breath could be your last, and every step might trigger an explosion that would scatter lives like desert sand. His partner, Officer Jake Nolan, carried the invisible scars of war in his steady hands and watchful eyes, the kind of wounds that never fully heal but transform a man into something harder, more vigilant, perpetually ready for the moment when training must overcome terror. Together, they had navigated minefields, where death whispered from beneath every footfall, had searched buildings where enemies lurked behind every corner, had saved countless lives through a partnership that transcended the boundaries between human and animal, soldier and protector. But war ends, and warriors must find new purposes for skills that were forged in fire and blood. Diesel's retirement should have meant peaceful walks through suburban neighborhoods, lazy afternoons in the sun, and the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. Jake's transition to small-town policing should have offered the calm routine of traffic stops and community events, a chance to serve without the constant threat of insurgent attacks or roadside bombs. Yet some gifts are too powerful to be silenced by civilian life, and some partnerships run too deep to be severed by changing circumstances. The night that would define the rest of their lives began like any other December evening in Franklin, with frost painting intricate patterns on car windshields and the kind of bone-deep cold that makes even the bravest souls hurry toward the warmth of home. Streetlights cast pools of amber illumination that barely pushed back the darkness, creating a patchwork of visibility and shadow that transformed familiar neighborhoods into landscapes of mystery. The garbage truck rumbling through the quiet streets was just another piece of municipal machinery performing its unglamorous but essential function. Its driver focused on the routine task of emptying bins and moving on to the next stop in an endless cycle of collection and disposal. But hidden within that routine, wrapped in darkness and desperation, lay a secret so profound that it would shatter the illusion of safety that small towns wear like armor against the chaos of the larger world. Sometimes the most extraordinary moments arrive disguised as ordinary ones, and sometimes the difference between tragedy and miracle comes down to the wisdom of an old soldier who never forgot how to listen to the whispers that others cannot hear. The leash went taut in Jake's hand, like a lifeline stretched to its breaking point as Diesel's massive frame locked into the stance that had preceded every life-saving discovery in the dusty villages of Helmand province. The garbage truck's diesel engine coughed and rumbled in the December air, its exhaust creating ghostly plumes that danced between the streetlights like spirits fleeing from some unseen horror. Jake felt the familiar electric charge that always preceded Diesel's alerts, a tension that seemed to crackle between them like invisible lightning, connecting two souls who had learned to communicate. Through instinct and shared purpose, the driver, oblivious to the drama unfolding mere feet from his mechanical routine, reached for the hydraulic controls with the casual indifference of someone who had performed this same action thousands of times before. But Diesel's body language screamed danger with the clarity of a fire alarm in a crowded theater. His ears were pinned forward so sharply they seemed to cut through the cold air, his dark eyes fixed on the black plastic bin with the intensity of a sniper acquiring a target. Jake's pulse hammered against his temples as muscle memory from Afghanistan flooded back, bringing with it the taste of desert dust and the sound of distant gunfire. This was the same focused alertness that had preceded the discovery of improvised explosive devices hidden beneath roadside debris, the same razor-sharp attention that had saved entire convoys from annihilation. The night air felt suddenly thinner, as if the atmosphere itself was holding its breath in anticipation of some revelation that would shatter the peaceful facade of suburban normalcy. Diesel's throat released a low rumble that seemed to originate from somewhere deeper than his chest, a sound that carried the weight of absolute certainty. Jake's hand instinctively moved toward his radio, but something in Diesel's posture told him this wasn't a situation for backup or procedural responses. This required the kind of trust that could only exist between partners who had faced death together and emerged stronger for the experience. The garbage truck's hydraulic arms began their mechanical ballet, reaching for the bin with the inexorable precision of machinery designed to consume and process whatever lay within its mechanical embrace. Diesel's rumble escalated into something more urgent, a vocalization that seemed to bridge the gap between animal instinct and human language. Jake had heard that exact tone only twice before, both times when Diesel had detected explosives, powerful enough to vaporize everything within a 50-foot radius. But this was Franklin, Indiana, not the bombed-out ruins of Afghan villages, and the enemy here was supposed to be limited to petty theft and domestic disputes. Yet Diesel's certainty was absolute, his body trembling not with fear, but with the desperate need to prevent something catastrophic from occurring in the next few seconds. The bark that exploded from Diesel's throat shattered the December silence like a gunshot, raw and primal and absolutely terrifying in its desperate urgency. Jake had never heard his partner produce a sound quite like this, not even in the moments when Taliban fighters had emerged from hidden bunkers with automatic weapons blazing. This was different, deeper, carrying an emotional weight that seemed to transcend the boundaries of species and strike directly at something fundamental in Jake's soul. The garbage truck driver froze with his hand halfway to the hydraulic controls, his annoyed expression shifting to confusion as Diesel lunged forward with such violent force that Jake's boots skidded across the icy pavement. The leash burned against his palm as he struggled to maintain control of 90 pounds of pure determination, watching in amazement as his retired partner transformed back into the focused warrior who had saved countless lives in the desert wastes of a distant war. The black bin swayed precariously in the mechanical grip, and from somewhere within its dark interior came a sound so faint it might have been imagination, so fragile it seemed on the verge of disappearing entirely. Jake's blood turned to ice as recognition dawned with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't the metallic scrape of garbage settling or the rustle of plastic bags shifting in the wind. This was organic, desperate, alive in a way that made his chest tighten with sudden terror. A whimper so small and helpless that it seemed to carry the weight of all the world's abandoned hopes. A cry that spoke of innocence on the very edge of extinction. Jake's training kicked in with brutal clarity as he shouted for the driver to stop the lift, his voice cutting through the night with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. Together, they wrestled the container back to ground level, Jake's hands shaking as he reached for the lid with the same careful precision he had once used to defuse roadside bombs. The stench that rose from within was a nauseating mixture of damp cloth and something metallic that made his stomach lurch with recognition. Blood, recent and still warm enough to carry its copper tang into the frozen air. Layers of newspaper and torn fabric gave way beneath his desperate fingers until his flashlight beam illuminated a sight that would haunt his dreams for years to come. Curled into a fetal position within a torn blanket, blue-lipped and barely breathing, was a newborn baby whose weak cries fluttered from tiny lungs, like the final whispers of a dying bird. Jake staggered backward as the full horror of the discovery crashed over him like a tsunami of disbelief and rage. Someone had thrown away a human life as casually as discarded garbage, had wrapped an innocent child in rags, and left him to die in the mechanical embrace of municipal waste disposal. But Diesel had heard what human ears could not detect, had sensed the presence of a soul in desperate need of salvation. Jake's world narrowed to a single point, to have crystalline focus as he stripped off his jacket and wrapped the tiny form against his chest, feeling the baby's fragile heartbeat flutter like a trapped butterfly beneath paper-thin skin. The child's lips were the color of winter twilight, his breathing so shallow it seemed more like occasional sighs than the steady rhythm of life. Training from a dozen emergency situations flooded back as Jake barked orders at the garbage truck driver, his voice carrying the sharp authority of someone who had commanded men in combat zones where hesitation meant death. The baby's eyes remained closed, tiny fists clenched as if still fighting some invisible battle for survival, and Jake found himself whispering reassurances that he wasn't sure either of them believed. Diesel stood sentinel beside them, his earlier desperation replaced by a watchful calm that spoke of a job well done, but his eyes never left the small bundle cradled in Jake's arms. The paramedics arrived with sirens wailing through the suburban quiet, their red and blue lights painting the scene in alternating waves of urgency and hope. Jake watched with the helpless intensity of a parent as trained hands took over, wrapping the child in heated blankets and checking vital signs with practiced efficiency. Oxygen flowed through a mask so small it seemed designed for a doll rather than a living human being, and the steady beep of monitors provided a technological heartbeat that gradually grew stronger and more regular. The baby's color slowly shifted from blue to pink, and his cries gained volume and strength, transforming from desperate whispers into the robust protests of someone determined to claim his place in the world. Jake felt something loosen in his chest as he realized they had arrived in time, that Diesel's incredible instincts had bridged the gap between life and death with seconds to spare. The garbage truck driver stood off to one side, pale and shaking, as the full implications of what had almost happened settled over him like a suffocating blanket. If Diesel hadn't barked, if Jake hadn't listened, if they had arrived even minutes later, this tiny life would have been compressed into anonymity within the truck's mechanical embrace. The ambulance pulled away with its precious cargo, leaving Jake and Diesel alone in the sudden quiet that followed the storm of emergency response. But even as the sirens faded into the distance, Jake knew this was only the beginning of a story that would challenge everything he thought he knew about human nature, about the capacity for both cruelty and redemption that existed within the human heart. Diesel sat beside him, tail thumping once against the frozen pavement, as if to say the first battle had been won, but the war for this child's future was just beginning. The silence that followed the ambulance's departure felt pregnant with secrets, heavy with the weight of questions that demanded answers, but whispered of dangers that lurked in the shadows of suburban normalcy. Jake stood in the amber pool of streetlight, his breath creating ghostly clouds as he surveyed the scene that had transformed from routine patrol into life-or-death rescue in the space of heartbeats. Diesel paced in slow circles around the spot where the garbage bin had sat, his nose working the frozen air with the methodical precision of a detective gathering evidence from invisible clues. The dog's behavior told Jake everything he needed to know about the gravity of their situation. This wasn't random abandonment or teenage panic, but something darker, more calculated, more dangerous than either of them had initially realized. Jake's flashlight beams swept across the pavement, searching for anything that might provide insight into the mind capable of such callous disregard for human life. A torn corner of fabric clung to the bin's edge, and Jake carefully bagged it with the same attention to detail he had once used to process evidence from insurgent attacks. Every piece of material, every trace of DNA, every fragment of hope or despair left behind could be the key to understanding not just what had happened, but what might happen next if they failed to act quickly and decisively. The neighborhood around them seemed to hold its breath, windows dark and doors locked against the December cold, but Jake knew that behind those facades of peaceful domesticity lay someone who had committed an act of such profound abandonment that it challenged the very foundations of human decency. Diesel's investigation led them in widening circles, his trained nose following scent trails that were invisible to human senses, but as clear as highway signs to his enhanced perception. They moved through the grid of suburban streets like hunters tracking prey, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were also being hunted, watched by eyes that remained hidden behind drawn curtains and locked doors. The baby, now safe in the sterile embrace of medical technology, represented more than just a rescued life. He was evidence of someone's desperation, someone's shame, someone's terrible choice to value secrecy over the sacred responsibility of protecting the innocent. But he was also a beacon of hope, proof that even in humanity's darkest moments, there existed souls like Diesel who refused to let evil triumph through indifference or fear. As they continued their methodical search, Jake felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling across his shoulders like an invisible mantle. This case would demand more than routine police work. It would require the kind of relentless pursuit that had characterized their most dangerous missions in Afghanistan, the willingness to follow evidence wherever it led, regardless of the personal cost or professional risk involved in pursuing the truth. The morning after the rescue dawned gray and bitter, with frost clinging to car windshields like crystallized tears and the kind of penetrating cold that seemed to seep through clothing and settle in the bones. Jake returned to the scene with Diesel, both of them driven by a compulsion that transcended professional duty and entered the realm of personal mission. The garbage truck was long gone, but the memory of its mechanical indifference lingered like a ghost haunting the intersection where a life had almost been lost to systematic disposal. Diesel moved with renewed purpose, his nose working the frozen air as he traced scent patterns. That told stories Jake could only guess at through observation of his partner's behavior. They expanded their search in methodical circles, checking every trash bin, every alley, every shadow that might conceal evidence of the desperate act that had unfolded in the darkness. It was Diesel who led them to the White House with peeling shutters, his body language shifting from investigative to alert as they approached the chain-link fence that surrounded a property that seemed to radiate an aura of secrets and shame. The mailbox read Connor in faded letters, and Jake recognized the name from his mental database of local residents. Harold Connor, retired steelworker, lived alone, kept to himself, no criminal record, not even a parking ticket to mark his passage through the official systems that monitored human behavior. But Diesel's instincts had never failed them before, and the dog's focused attention on this particular house sent warning signals through Jake's consciousness like alarm bells in a burning building. They found the evidence scattered like breadcrumbs from a fairy tale, small pieces of a larger puzzle that spoke of preparation and desperation in equal measure. A torn corner of baby wipe packaging on the front steps, placed so carefully it seemed like a message left for those wise enough to interpret its significance. Behind the bushes that lined the side of the house, partially concealed but not completely hidden, lay a plastic grocery bag that contained the detritus of shame and terror, strips of blood-stained fabric, an empty formula bottle, a cracked pacifier, and most damning of all, a crumpled note written on ruled paper in handwriting that seemed to tremble with exhaustion and fear. The ink had run from moisture, but the words remained legible enough to pierce Jake's heart with their desperate simplicity. "I'm sorry. Please don't hate me. I had no choice." Jake felt his jaw tighten as he carefully bagged the evidence, each piece another fragment of a story that was becoming clearer and more horrifying with every discovery. This wasn't the work of a hardened criminal or someone motivated by malice, but rather the desperate act of someone who had been convinced that abandonment was the only option available to protect both mother and child from something even worse than death. The forensics lab worked with the focused intensity of archaeologists, uncovering ancient secrets, each piece of evidence yielding clues that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of coercion, manipulation, and the kind of psychological control that transforms victims into accomplices in their own destruction. Jake stood in Detective Lana Brooks' office, watching her review the preliminary reports with the grim expression of someone who had seen too many cases where adults had failed children in ways that defied comprehension. The baby blanket had been traced to a hospital supply batch distributed to county clinics, suggesting the birth had occurred within the official medical system, but under circumstances that had driven the mother to desperate secrecy afterward. The handwriting analysis revealed stress patterns consistent with someone writing under extreme emotional duress, and the blood evidence confirmed recent childbirth, but showed no signs of medical complications that would have justified such drastic action. Security footage from a neighbor's Ring camera provided the final pieces of the puzzle, showing a hooded figure at 3:12 a.m., carrying what appeared to be a large container, moving with the furtive desperation of someone convinced they were being hunted. The figure's build and gait suggested a teenager, someone young enough to be overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control, but old enough to understand the finality of the choice they were making. Jake studied the grainy footage with the same intensity he had once applied to surveillance videos of insurgent activity, looking for details that might reveal identity or motive or some clue about the forces that had driven this person to such extreme measures. But it was the second search of the Connor property that yielded the most damning evidence, hidden in the back shed beneath old lumber and beer crates, like toxic secrets buried in the foundation of suburban respectability. More baby clothes, more formula wrappers, more evidence of preparation and planning, but also something that made Jake's blood run cold with recognition of evil's casual banality. A notebook filled with scribbled threats and promises, and in the margins of one page, written in the same trembling handwriting as the apology note, "I can't tell anyone. He said he'd hurt the baby if I did." The words hung in the air between Jake and Lana like a toxic cloud, transforming their understanding of the case from simple abandonment to something far more sinister. This wasn't just about a teenage mother overwhelmed by circumstances. It was about systematic intimidation, about someone using a child's vulnerability as leverage to maintain control over a situation that should have been met with support and compassion rather than threats and manipulation. Jake felt the familiar burn of combat rage building in his chest, the same fury that had sustained him through firefights with enemies who targeted civilians and used human shields to protect their cowardice. The investigation shifted into a higher gear as Jake and Lana assembled the pieces of a puzzle that revealed layers of manipulation and control that had transformed a vulnerable teenager into a victim of her own desperation. Harold Connor, the name on the mailbox, had disappeared like smoke in the wind, leaving behind only the detritus of his psychological warfare and the lingering stench of fear that seemed to permeate every corner of his abandoned property. Security cameras at a nearby gas station had captured footage of a man matching Connor's description, purchasing a burner phone and a bottle of whiskey at 2 a.m, his movements furtive and desperate as he prepared for what appeared to be an extended period of hiding from the consequences of his actions. Jake felt the familiar weight of pursuit settling into his bones, the same relentless drive that had sustained him through months of hunting insurgents, through the labyrinthine streets of Afghan villages where enemies could disappear into civilian populations like ghosts fading into morning mist. But this hunt was different, more personal, fueled by the memory of tiny blue lips and desperate cries that had almost been silenced forever by mechanical indifference. Diesel seemed to sense the shift in their mission's urgency, his behavior becoming more focused and alert as they canvassed the area around Connor's last known location, with the methodical precision of soldiers clearing hostile territory. The breakthrough came when a patrol unit reported a vagrant matching Connor's description spotted near the women's shelter where Malene, the 15-year-old mother they had finally identified, was staying with her newborn son under protective custody. The timing felt too coincidental to be random, and Jake's combat instincts screamed warnings about predators who refused to accept defeat gracefully. They found evidence of Connor's surveillance in the form of cigarette butts and footprints behind the shelter's dumpster, along with something that made Jake's blood run cold with recognition of evil's persistent nature. Carved into the brick wall with a sharp object were the words, "You think you saved her," followed by symbols that Jake recognized from his military experience as markers used by insurgents to identify targets for future attacks. Connor wasn't just hiding, he was planning some form of retaliation against the girl who had dared to seek protection from his psychological terrorism. The shelter went into lockdown mode, while Jake coordinated with local law enforcement to establish a perimeter that would prevent Connor from getting close enough to fulfill whatever twisted fantasy he had constructed around reclaiming control over his victim's life. But Jake knew from experience that cornered predators were the most dangerous kind, driven by desperation to prove their power, even when surrounded by superior forces dedicated to protecting their intended victims. The trap closed around Harold Connor with the inexorable precision of military strategy applied to civilian law enforcement. Every escape route monitored, every potential hiding place searched with the thoroughness of soldiers clearing rooms in hostile territory. Jake and Diesel moved through the December darkness like shadows given purpose, their partnership refined by years of combat experience into something that transcended normal police work and entered the realm of specialized warfare. The manhunt had transformed the quiet streets of Franklin into a battlefield where every doorway represented potential danger and every shadow could conceal an enemy determined to inflict maximum damage before accepting defeat. Connor's pattern of behavior suggested someone operating on a timeline of desperation, making increasingly reckless decisions as his options narrowed and the net of law enforcement tightened around his remaining refugees. At 3:17 a.m., the same time Malene had abandoned her baby in the garbage bin, a figure matching Connor's description was spotted moving through an alley 2 blocks from the shelter, his movements furtive but determined as he approached the building that housed the woman who had dared to defy his psychological control. Jake felt adrenaline surge through his system as he and Diesel closed the distance with the silent efficiency of predators hunting prey, their breathing synchronized and their movements coordinated through years of shared experience in situations where hesitation meant death. The confrontation unfolded in the stark illumination of security lights that transformed the alley into a stage where justice and vengeance would compete for dominance in the space of heartbeats. Connor emerged from the shadows like something diseased, his eyes carrying the wild gleam of someone who had crossed the line from manipulation into open violence, a man who had convinced himself that destroying what he could not control was preferable to accepting defeat. Diesel's growl carried the authority of a warrior who had faced down enemies in far more dangerous circumstances, and Jake drew his weapon with the fluid motion of someone prepared to use lethal force to protect the innocent from the predatory nature of evil. The arrest happened with anticlimactic efficiency, Connor's bluster and threats collapsing like a house of cards when confronted with the reality of armed professionals who had faced far more dangerous enemies than a middle-aged bully drunk on his own sense of entitlement. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Jake felt a familiar satisfaction settle into his bones, the same sense of completion that had followed successful missions in Afghanistan, where good had triumphed over evil through preparation, courage, and the unbreakable bond between human and canine partners who refused to let darkness claim victory over light. The courthouse in Franklin County had witnessed countless human dramas unfold within its wood-paneled chambers, but few stories carried the emotional weight of a 15-year-old girl fighting for the right to protect the child she had almost lost to her own desperation and fear. Malene sat beside Jake on the hard wooden bench, her hands steady now as she cradled baby Theo against her chest, the child's healthy pink complexion and bright alert eyes bearing testament to the resilience of life when given proper care and unconditional love. The transformation in both mother and child over the past weeks had been nothing short of miraculous, each day bringing new strength to bodies that had been pushed to the very edge of survival by circumstances that no human being should have been forced to endure. Harold Connor's trial had been swift and decisive, his defense attorney unable to construct any reasonable explanation for behavior that had pushed a vulnerable teenager toward infanticide as a perceived solution to threats of violence and abandonment. The evidence spoke with damning clarity about systematic psychological abuse designed to isolate and control, about a predator who had used his position of authority to transform what should have been a celebration of new life into a nightmare of shame and terror. But justice in the courtroom was only the beginning of healing for souls that had been wounded by betrayal of the most fundamental trust that should exist between adults and the children placed in their care. Jake watched Malene's face as the judge granted her supervised custody of Theo, noting the way her eyes filled with tears that spoke of relief rather than sorrow, of hope rather than despair, of a future that stretched ahead filled with possibility rather than the suffocating certainty of doom that had characterized her recent past. The foster care system had failed her in ways that would require systematic change to prevent future tragedies, but individual compassion had stepped into the gap where institutions had proven inadequate to protect the most vulnerable members of society. Diesel lay beside Jake's feet, his graying muzzle resting on crossed paws as he maintained his vigilant watch over the small family that his instincts had rescued from the mechanical indifference of a system that almost discarded precious life like unwanted garbage. The old warrior's eyes tracked every movement in the courtroom with the same alertness that had characterized his service in Afghanistan, his protective instincts undimmed by retirement or the passage of years that had silvered his coat and slowed his gait, but never diminished his commitment to standing guard over innocence, threatened by the casual cruelty of those who had forgotten the sacred nature of trust placed in their hands by vulnerable souls, seeking only safety and acceptance in a world that too often rewards predatory behavior with silence and complicity. Jake's house had never echoed with the sounds of infant life before, but the walls seemed to embrace the gentle chaos that Theo brought into rooms that had known only the quiet companionship of a man and his canine partner living in the aftermath of war's invisible wounds. The guest bedroom had been transformed into a nursery, with the same methodical precision that Jake had once applied to establishing secure perimeters in hostile territory, every detail considered and planned to provide maximum safety and comfort for the newest member of their unconventional family. Malene moved through her new environment with the cautious hope of someone learning to trust in stability after a lifetime of betrayal and abandonment, her movements becoming more confident with each day that passed without crisis or threat, or the sound of angry voices echoing through rooms that should have been sanctuaries but had been turned into prisons by adults who had forgotten their responsibility to protect rather than exploit. The rhythm of their days settled into patterns that felt both foreign and familiar, punctuated by Theo's feeding schedule and Malene's online classes as she worked toward completing her GED under Circumstances that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier, when survival had been measured in hours rather than years. Diesel adapted to his new role as guardian and protector, with the same dedication he had once brought to detecting explosives and searching for enemies hidden in the shadows of desert warfare, his presence a constant reminder that vigilance and loyalty could transcend species and circumstance when driven by the fundamental imperative to shield innocence from harm. Jake found himself rediscovering aspects of his own humanity that had been buried beneath layers of combat trauma and professional detachment. The simple act of holding a bottle for a hungry infant, reconnecting him to purposes that existed beyond duty and honor, and the abstract concepts that had sustained him through years of military service. The house filled with laughter and the mundane dramas of daily life, with Meline's artwork covering the refrigerator and Theo's sleep schedule dictating the flow of activities that had once revolved around patrol schedules and case files, and the solitary pursuits of a man who had grown accustomed to living with only memories for company. Community support emerged from unexpected quarters as neighbors who had initially viewed the arrangement with skepticism began bringing casseroles and baby clothes, their hearts opened by the visible transformation of a young woman who was blossoming under conditions of safety and acceptance rather than wilting, under threats and manipulation designed to crush her spirit and steal her future before she had a chance to discover her own strength and resilience. The recognition came quietly at first, local news stations picking up the story of the retired Canine whose instincts had saved a life on a frozen December night, but it grew into something larger as word spread through social media channels and national networks, hungry for stories that restored faith in the fundamental goodness that still existed in a world too often dominated by headlines of violence and despair. Jake had never sought publicity for himself or Diesel, their military service having taught them that the most important victories were often the ones that went unrecorded in official histories or medal ceremonies, but he recognized the power of Meline and Theo's story to inspire others who might be struggling with circumstances that seemed hopeless and insurmountable. The town council's ceremony, honoring local first responders, felt surreal to Jake as he stood beside Diesel on the platform erected in Franklin's town square, looking out at faces that reflected a mixture of admiration and curiosity about the partnership that had bridged the gap between military service and civilian protection with such dramatic results. Diesel accepted the attention with the stoic dignity of a veteran who understood that ceremonies were for the living, while the real meaning of service was measured in lives saved and futures preserved, rather than ribbons and speeches and the applause of crowds who would never fully comprehend the weight of decisions made in moments when hesitation meant death. The mayor's words about heroism and duty washed over Jake like distant thunder. His attention focused instead on Meline and Theo sitting in the front row, the baby's healthy complexion and bright eyes serving as the only recognition that truly mattered in a world where actions spoke with greater authority than accolades. Letters arrived from across the country, from other Canine handlers and military veterans who recognized something familiar in the story of a dog whose service had transcended retirement to save an innocent life from the casual indifference of bureaucratic systems that sometimes lost sight of the individual souls they were meant to protect. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from unexpected sources, from other teenagers who had faced similar circumstances of abuse and abandonment, who found hope in Meline's story and strength in the knowledge that rescue could arrive in the most unlikely forms when least expected. The ripple effects extended beyond Franklin's borders as animal rescue organizations reported increased adoption requests for retired military and police dogs, people inspired by Diesel's example to provide homes for canine veterans whose specialized training could be channeled into civilian purposes that honored their service while meeting their need for continued purpose, and partnership with humans who understood the value of loyalty and dedication that transcended the boundaries between species and circumstance. The winter gradually loosened its grip on Franklin, Indiana, as spring's first tentative gestures began painting the landscape in shades of green and possibility. But the changes that had transformed Jake's household ran deeper than seasonal cycles and touched something fundamental about the nature of family and purpose and the ways that broken souls could heal when given the chance to serve something larger than their own pain and isolation. Meline had blossomed into a confident young mother whose artistic talents found expression in drawings that captured moments of grace and hope with the same intensity that her earlier sketches had reflected despair and abandonment, her favorite subject being Diesel, in various poses of vigilant protection that seemed to embody the spirit of guardianship that had saved her son's life and given her own existence new meaning and direction. Theo grew stronger with each passing day, his laughter filling rooms that had known only silence for too long, his innocent joy serving as daily proof that love could triumph over the most determined efforts of those who sought to destroy rather than nurture the precious gift of new life. Jake found himself changed in ways he couldn't have anticipated when he first heard Diesel's desperate barking on that frozen December night, his own capacity for connection and vulnerability expanded by the experience of watching courage bloom in the most unlikely circumstances and witnessing the power of second chances to transform tragedy into triumph. But questions lingered in the quiet moments between feeding schedules and bedtime routines, mysteries about human nature that would never be fully resolved through courts of law or social service interventions. What forces had shaped Harold Connor into a predator who could threaten an infant's life to maintain control? Over a frightened teenager, how many other Malines existed in the shadows of respectability, trapped by circumstances and intimidation into believing that abandonment was their only option for protecting the children they loved? And perhaps, most unsettling of all, how many Theos had been lost to indifference and systematic failures before Diesel's extraordinary senses had pierced the veil of municipal routine to detect a life hanging in the balance between salvation and disposal? The answers to these questions remained elusive, hidden in the complex intersection of poverty and power, vulnerability and exploitation, silence and the kind of courage that could emerge from the most unexpected sources when faced with moral imperatives that transcended personal safety. As Jake sat on his porch watching Diesel patrol the yard with undiminished vigilance, he wondered what other secrets lay hidden in the ordinary darkness of suburban nights, waiting for someone with extraordinary senses to hear. The cries that others could not detect and refused to let evil triumph through indifference or fear. And you, have you ever witnessed any heroic animal act? Tell us your story in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next videos.